Hey guys, tonight we step into a world that feels distant, but shaped everything we are. A time when survival wasn't guaranteed by strength or courage, but by silence, luck, and how well you followed rules you never agreed to. This isn't a heroic tale. It's not about knights or glory. It's about aching feet, empty bowls, cold floors, and the quiet fear that you might not make it to morning. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It's quietly powerful to see how far these forgotten lives still echo. If you find comfort in these slow, shadowed corners of history, feel free to subscribe. You're always welcome here. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or some soft background noise. And let's begin. Yuri waking up in a one-room cottage. Your breath is fog in the morning air. And nothing today is promised. You do not wake to birdsong. You wake to the sound of coughing. It echoes from the other side of the room, wet, tired, constant. Your brother again. He hasn't stopped in days. But no one says anything. You all pretend not to hear it. In this house, illness is not discussed unless it turns to death. You are 10 years old. Old enough to work. Old enough to die. The straw mattress beneath you is damp. Not soaked, but damp in the way straw gets when it's shared by too many bodies, too much breath, and too little warmth. The scent of your sister's hair is close. She sleeps beside you, curled up like a cat, fists against her chest. She's still dreaming. You envy her. There are no windows in the loft. Only cracks between the planks. It is not morning yet, but you can tell the night is thinning. A pale thread of gray lies across the slats. You have minutes left before the day demands your body. Downstairs, the hearth is cold. The ashes are soft and white. You climb down the ladder quietly, bare feet against the wood. Your mother is already there, hunched over a pot with no fire under it. She is not cooking. She is pretending. Stirring air to feel like she's doing something. There is nothing left to boil. Not until the garden yields again. You speak barely. A word. Maybe two. You do not ask questions. Not about breakfast. Not about your brother. Not about the man asleep in the chair. You do not know if he is family. He comes and goes. Sometimes he brings bread. Sometimes he brings fists. Your mother never tells him to leave. Outside, the frost is thin, but sharp. It bites your soles as you step into the yard. You're sent to fetch water. The bucket is metal and the handle bites your hand. The well is not far, but the ground is uneven and your feet ache. You do not wear shoes unless you are going to church. You are not going to church. At the well, there is already a girl you know. Her name is Eloise. She is older than you by 3 years, but smaller. Her left arm does not work right. A midwife once said it was twisted in the womb. No one helped her after that. She does not speak much. Today she gives you a nod. You nod back. It is the closest thing to friendship you will know this week. The water is heavy. When you return home, the door is open and your sister is outside, being scolded. She let the fire go out completely, they say. You know it's not her fault. There was no fuel left to keep it. But someone has to be blamed. She stands still, eyes low. The man raises his hand, but doesn't strike. Not today. The bucket is poured. Some of it is used to clean a cloth. Your brother is wheezing now. Your mother wets the rag and presses it to his head. He doesn't flinch. You wonder if he is awake. You wonder if it matters. You eat nothing. You are used to this. Hunger is not a surprise, it is a companion. Some mornings there is bread. Other mornings weak soup. Today there is silence. You wipe your hands on your tunic and go outside. The village is stirring. Thin smoke climbs from the blacksmith's roof. A pig squeals somewhere behind the baker's. A dog limps across the road, nose down, ribs showing. You wonder when it last ate. You wonder when you last did. You have work today. Not real work, not yet. But enough to keep your legs tired and your back bent. You are sent to help the cooper gather wood. He is not unkind, but he speaks little. He lets you sit when your hands blister. That makes him good in your mind. The trees behind the village are damp. You know not to stray too far. There are rumors of wolves, though no one's seen one in years. Still, it is better to be safe. You carry back small branches. The cooper takes the larger ones. He shows you how to sort them. You pretend to understand. By mid-morning your stomach aches. Not sharply, just constantly. The ache that comes when the body remembers food, but not the feeling of being full. You drink from the stream. It tastes like iron. The cooper says nothing. When the church bell rings, you stop. Everyone does. It does not mean service. It means the priest has passed. He does this each morning. A silent reminder that God sees everything. You are not sure if that comforts you. You return home briefly before noon. Your mother is gone, likely to the market, though there is little to sell. The man is still there, asleep again. Your sister is sweeping ashes. Your brother is silent. You sit on the floor. Not because you are tired, but because there is no chair for you. Children sit on floors. That is how it is. You watch a fly land on the wall, then on your arm. You do not brush it away. It is something to feel. A sensation. A presence. It makes the silence feel less empty. You wait. Because that is what the first half of the day is, not activity, but waiting. For food. For instruction. For something to break the rhythm of hunger and stillness. But nothing comes. And so the morning ends. Quietly. As it began. No declarations. No noise. Just a slow descent from not quite night into not quite day. And a hope, small and unspoken, that the second half of this day might be easier than the first. It does not begin with screaming. Hunger rarely does. It starts in silence, quiet and crawling, beneath your ribs, behind your thoughts. The kind of ache that sneaks into the corners of your mind before your stomach even knows what to do with it. On your first day in medieval life, this is the companion you meet earliest. Not the noble lord or the singing minstrel, but hunger, unadorned and cruel. It's still early morning, and the sun is slow to rise over the gray slush of the village road. There is no breakfast table waiting. No steaming cup of tea. No soft crust of bread to split with butter. You're expected to work before you eat, if you're lucky enough to eat at all. The concept of mealtimes is flexible. Meals come not with the hour, but with the opportunity. And opportunity is in short supply. The woman you now live with, your host in this strange past, stares at you from under a ragged linen head wrap. Her hands are red and cracked. She doesn't ask if you're hungry. Hunger is a given. Instead, she hands you a bucket. It's time to fetch water. You walk for nearly a mile, barefoot, cold mud squeezing between your toes. The wooden pail is heavy on the way back, sloshing against your knees. You spill some. She says nothing but sighs as she takes it. By midday, your stomach feels like it's folding in on itself. There is a faint ache behind your eyes, and your arms tremble from fatigue. You sit on a stool near the hearth, where a pot boils with something, perhaps turnips, perhaps bitter herbs. A bit of barley if fortune is kind. But you learn quickly, this food isn't just for you. It's shared among 5, 6, sometimes 8 people. And there's never enough. Bowls are scraped clean with fingers. Spoons are rare. The bread, if there is bread, is hard. Not just stale, but stone-like. You chew for minutes, working your jaw until it aches. Teeth chip. Gums bleed. You drink water to soften the bite, but the water is barely clean. You smell the iron in it, and it churns in your belly with the turnip mash. Still, you are lucky. Hunger is worse elsewhere. Down the road, a child cries. Not because he's hurt. Because he is used to crying at this hour. His mother tries to hush him with a pinch of flour and rainwater, stirred into paste. This is his porridge. In the monastery nearby, the monks eat slightly better. Their table offers beans, leeks, bread, sometimes fish. But you are not welcome at their table. At most, you will be given scraps. Or, if you prove useful, maybe a ladle of soup thickened with oats. You begin to dream of oats. The body adjusts, eventually, but not without cost. Your stomach shrinks. Your thoughts slow. You forget what fullness feels like. The days stretch into weeks. On feast days, saints' days or weddings, there may be roasted goose or spiced ale, but these are not for you. You watch from a distance as others laugh with full mouths. And so, hunger becomes not just a sensation, but a lesson. It teaches you patience. It teaches you silence. You do not ask for seconds. You do not ask at all. Hunger trains you in humility. It shapes your posture and your voice. It determines when you sleep, how long you work, how well you think. By the end of your first month, your cheekbones sharpen. Your belt fits looser. Your fingernails grow slower. You wake in the night not from noise, but from the gnawing emptiness in your belly. Hunger becomes your clock. And then comes Lent. 40 days of fasting, imposed by the church. Even those who had little must now have less. Meat is forbidden. Dairy, too. Eggs are given up. For those already starving, Lent is indistinguishable from daily life. But the guilt now comes with it. You are told to thank God for your suffering. To pray, not for food, but for forgiveness. You begin to understand that in medieval times, hunger isn't just a biological need. It's a moral test. A measure of your piety. A sign of your humility. A divine instrument used to purify the soul. But your soul feels no cleaner. Only hungrier. On Sundays, the church bells toll. You sit through Mass on an empty stomach, kneeling, standing, kneeling again. The priest speaks of salvation. But your thoughts drift to the cabbage you saw in someone's cart. A loaf of rye bread cradled in an old woman's arm. Hunger makes you jealous. Not cruel, but aching. By now you know where to look. The baker's door. The abbey's refuse heap. You begin to recognize the smell of roasted onions from 100 yards away. You become, without meaning to, a hunter, not of animals, but of chances. A missed crust. A broken egg. But hunger does not make you wild. It makes you watchful. And in this strange new life, you realize that survival isn't about strength, it's about quiet observation. About knowing who has food, when they discard it, and how not to be seen when you retrieve it. And still, you whisper thanks. Because you are not dead. Not yet. The hunger teaches gratitude too. For a root pulled from the dirt. For a wormy apple. For broth thinned 3 times over. Hunger shrinks your world, until all that matters is the next spoonful. And when you sleep, if you sleep, you dream not of escape, but of bread. And when you wake, hunger will be waiting. Welcome to medieval life. The first moments of the morning did not begin with sunlight or birdsong. They began with the unmistakable scent of human waste, wafting from the corner of the room. In most medieval homes, there was no such thing as plumbing. No bathroom, no pipes, no toilet seats carved to fit the body. What one had was a wooden or clay chamber pot, and if you were lucky, it had a lid. If you weren't, it simply sat in the corner of your one-room home, a quiet reminder that nature's needs did not wait for sunrise. Children learned quickly where not to step. The floors were often dirt, sometimes packed with straw, sometimes not. If the pot was full, someone had to carry it to the dung heap outside, or to the edge of the street, where it might be hurled into the gutter. But most of the time, that job fell to the youngest. Little feet, still uncertain in their steps, tottered through morning shadows with a sloshing pot in hand, knowing full well the shame of a spill. Cleanliness was not a daily event but a seasonal ambition. Baths were rare, not due to ignorance but to the realities of water access, firewood scarcity, and communal priorities. If you were a peasant child, you did not have a washcloth. You had a sleeve. If your face was dirty, it stayed dirty unless it rained. Sometimes, if the church bells rang long enough and the village priest declared a saint's feast, you'd be scrubbed with soap made from animal fat. But most days, your scent marked you clearly, alive, poor, and enduring. The morning chores came swiftly, without gentleness. Feeding the animals if you had them. Collecting eggs or drawing water from the well, assuming the line of neighbors hadn't formed already. And if it was winter, you did it in the dark, your breath fogging the air like a whisper that couldn't be spoken aloud. For girls, the day's duties stretched even longer. From the age of 5 or 6, they helped their mothers prepare bread, not in warm ovens but in crude stone hearths, the heat unpredictable and the smoke always finding their eyes. Boys might be sent to the fields, but girls stayed home, where care work blurred into survival work. Tending to younger siblings, crushing grain, spinning wool. These weren't lessons. They were life. If you could do them, you were useful. If not, you were a burden. But in between the routines, there were the rituals, and the church was always watching. Before you learned to read, you learned to kneel. Before you understood Latin, you memorized the rhythm of prayers. Before you knew your own voice, you learned when to be silent. Medieval childhood was wrapped tightly in the arms of religion, not as comfort, but as command. Each morning, the village might hear the toll of the Angelus bell, a signal to pause and pray. Children in homes and fields alike were expected to stop, even mid-task, and cross themselves. In church, they were not coddled. They were watched. Eyes scanning for slouching backs or wandering thoughts. Confession could begin at a young age, and communion too, but only if one knew the catechism, if one could recite the answers without stammer. Sin was not something you grew into. It was something you inherited. Even the smallest child was born into the world tainted by original sin, and if they died unbaptized, the consequences, though silently debated, were whispered in warnings. Limbo, some said. Others worse. Baptism was not just a rite. It was protection. Infants were rushed to priests when sick, not just for healing, but for spiritual security. And so children, even toddlers, were taught to fear hell long before they understood geography. The devil was not metaphor. He was a figure with hooves and flame, hiding behind the sins of laziness or disobedience. A child who lied or stole might be told their soul would roast like a pig at Judgment Day. Not in jest. In warning. Yet despite the weight of punishment, faith also stitched small beauty into bleakness. Church feast days could mean sweeter bread or a piece of meat. Saints' days might include processions, where children held candles and walked beneath banners sewn by mothers with trembling hands. These moments, brief, flickering, offered some color in a world of browns and grays. But the pressure never stopped. Boys were told they would grow to be heads of households, to plow and tithe and defend. Girls were told they would serve, as wives or nuns, rarely as anything else. And if a child seemed too slow, too quiet, or too strange, there were murmurs. Spirits. Curses. Perhaps a punishment for the mother's secret sin. Perhaps not a child at all, but a changeling swapped by fairies. In villages without doctors, imagination was often the only diagnosis. In the margins of daily life, there were attempts at joy. A carved doll made from bone. A tune hummed while sweeping ash from the hearth. A brother's grin while stealing a second potato. But these were flickers, not flames. To be a child in the medieval world was not to be protected from reality. It was to be introduced to it with immediacy and without filter. The idea of innocence was not sentimentalized. There were no birthday parties, no lullabies written just for you. Your name was often reused from a dead sibling. Your shoes were not new, if you had them. And your value, quietly and constantly, was measured by how little trouble you caused. Yet still, children survived. They played in the mud. They climbed trees when no one was watching. They whispered stories by candlelight, mimicking the priests and monsters they saw in stained glass. And they dreamed, not of escape, but of surviving to the next season. In the medieval world, every day was a test. Every child who woke up and worked was already part of history. Not written in ink, but in ash, in sweat, in silence. Long before the sun crested the village roofs, long before the roosters crowed or the hearths were stoked, the smallest members of the household were already awake. Childhood, in the modern sense, did not truly exist in the Middle Ages. Not as we know it today, with toys, schooling, and long stretches of imaginative play. In a medieval home, a child was not a dreamer, but a worker. A quiet presence at the edge of every task, watching, learning, and eventually doing. For the poorest families, the day began in darkness, not poetic darkness, but a practical, cold one. The kind where the only warmth came from another body under the same threadbare blanket. Little feet touched earthen floors, still damp from the night's chill. A child might be 6, maybe 7, and already she would be expected to stir the ashes, relight the hearth, fetch water from the stream if it hadn't frozen solid. The bucket was heavy. Her arms were small. But the family needed tea, broth, or simply heat. There was no question of choice. Tasks weren't delegated, they were absorbed, passed down like names or stories or scars. The small hands that picked stones from barley before it could be milled, the small fingers that stitched coarse wool, the small shoulders that carried wood from the edge of the forest. These were not exceptions. They were the rhythm of life. Work was not punishment. It was simply presence. If you stood still, you were expected to help. If you watched long enough, someone would hand you something, a jug, a rag, a spindle, and your watching would become doing. Even play, if it occurred, mimicked labor. Children herded chickens, not for fun, but for food. They swept dust into corners not for games, but for pride. Their joy came from being included, not entertained. Older children, 9, 10, 11, blurred fully into the adult world. A girl might serve in another home, carry baskets to market, knead bread beside her mother. A boy might herd sheep for days alone, sleep beside dogs, learn the weight of a blade. They listened more than they spoke. And when they did speak, it was often to ask for more instructions. Education was rare. In towns, some boys were sent to monasteries or cathedral schools. But most rural children would never learn to write their own names. Their lessons were oral, the rules of behavior, the consequences of defiance, the boundaries of the sacred and the forbidden. A child might know every saint's feast day but never see his own birthday celebrated. Meals were quiet, brief, and often taken standing. A child learned quickly not to complain. Hunger was normal. Suffering was expected. Gratitude was whispered. The softest bread was for the elders. The last portion of stew was taken only after everyone else declined it twice. These small rituals of deference were never taught, only absorbed. Girls watched their mothers kneel, curtsy, mend. Boys mimicked their father's gait, their silences, their stares. The boundaries of adulthood arrived not with parties or gifts, but with responsibility. One day, you were a child holding a basket. The next, you were expected to carry it alone. In wealthier homes, the rhythm was different, but the expectations remained. Noble children might have toys, carved animals, painted dolls, tiny figurines. But even these were not just playthings. They were training tools. A wooden sword was a lesson. A miniature loom was a prophecy. Servants attended noble children, but rarely with gentleness. Wet nurses fed them. Tutors scolded them. Fathers rarely held them. Mothers dressed them for display. Love existed, but it was often veiled in duty. Even affection was conditional, tied to obedience, to appearance, to how well the child served the family's ambitions. There were no diaries, no private thoughts, no locked journals. A child's world was entirely visible, entirely supervised. Privacy was a luxury reserved for monks and widows. Everyone else lived in view. When a child cried, they were hushed. When they asked questions, they were told to listen. When they faltered, they were reminded of others who had it worse. Sympathy was rare. Resilience was praised. But not all was bleak. In brief moments, joy slipped through. A child might laugh during a village festival, eat honeycomb at Lent, or lie under the stars and dream of saints. They might whisper secrets to a sibling in a hayloft, carve initials into a beam, or sing softly while washing cloth in the stream. These moments did not erase the labor, but they softened it. They offered small sparks in long winters. And sometimes, in these moments, childhood glimmered, not in freedom, but in resilience. The church, too, had its role. Children learned to fear hell early, to kneel properly, to whisper Latin they didn't understand. But they also lit candles, rang bells, and sang hymns. Faith was not separate from their lives. It was the water they drank, the fire they warmed by, the lullaby they fell asleep to. Some children died before they could remember their names. Others lived into old age and forgot nothing. But whether their lives were short or long, whether they served bread or bore swords, their days were marked by the same quiet effort, to be useful, to be good, to be loved. And in this effort, they carved out a kind of childhood. Not loud, not free, but real, and remembered, if only faintly, in the corners of parchment and prayer. This was not the childhood of fairy tales. It was the childhood of mud, of firelight, of hushed instruction and silent pride. And in this quiet, in this labor, in this long, slow unfolding of duty, medieval childhood took its shape. There were no clean slates in a medieval village, not for children, not for parents, not for the fragile spaces between. The home itself was not a sanctuary in the modern sense. It was porous, a place where weather seeped in through the thatch, where gossip passed through cracks in the timber walls, where the scent of illness, or unwashed skin, or curdled milk became part of the air one breathed in, even in sleep. In this world, a child's bedroom did not exist. There were no pastel cribs, no alphabet-patterned blankets. Only straw-filled pallets beside the hearth, or a shared corner in a single-room cottage, shoulder to shoulder with siblings, elders, and sometimes even livestock. The sounds of childhood were not laughter alone, but coughing, creaking, and the scraping of spoons in empty bowls. Children learned early how to move silently around adult fatigue, to stop crying when the baby slept, to rise when the rooster crowed, to accept that space and time did not belong to them. Their days were governed not by curiosity but by rhythm, the rhythm of labor, of church bells, of hunger and its occasional relief. In many homes, especially among the peasantry, a child's name might not be spoken sweetly, but barked out mid-task. There was no indulgence in pet names or dreamy futures. Children were seen less as individuals and more as limbs of the household machine. Yet amid the routine and the dust, moments of tenderness still appeared. A shared crust of bread handed from mother to child. A lullaby murmured at dusk, even if the words were more superstition than story. A father's roughened hand steadying a toddler's first steps in the cold mud outside the door. These were not grand gestures, but they mattered. They were a kind of soft resistance to the grinding wheel of medieval survival. They were how love survived in places too poor to speak its name aloud. Work defined much of a child's purpose. Even before they were old enough to be useful, they were taught to be present, to watch, to imitate, to absorb. A girl might begin by fetching water, her small arms trembling under the weight of the bucket. A boy might trail his father into the fields, dragging a broken-handled rake behind him. No one was idle. No one had the luxury of waiting to grow up. Childhood was not a protected realm but a shallow bank from which one was quickly swept into the current of adult labor. Discipline, too, was a constant. There were no debates about gentle parenting. Obedience was necessary, and correction swift. Many families used rods or belts, not out of cruelty but because that was what they believed kept a child alive, from wandering too close to a fire, or stealing food that wasn't theirs, or speaking out of turn to a visiting reeve. Shame, too, was a tool. Children were often scolded in front of siblings or neighbors. Their errors made public. Because reputation, even at a young age, was considered a kind of currency, one that could shape a child's future long before they were old enough to understand what that meant. Some of the hardest lessons came not from discipline, but from watching life slip away. It was not unusual for a child to witness death before they could write their own name. Siblings lost to fever. Infants buried without baptism. Neighbors crushed by carts or claimed by famine. These events were not shielded from young eyes. They were part of the landscape. And so, the innocence we often associate with childhood was replaced by a quiet familiarity with grief. Children did not speak of it often, but they carried it in the way they looked at the fire, or in the way they clutched their younger siblings' hands during church processions. Play existed, but it came in scraps. A wooden top spun in the dirt, while a parent mended clothes. A game of chase between chores. Dolls carved from straw and wrapped in rags. These amusements were not daily, nor guaranteed. But when they appeared, they lit the world briefly. They reminded even the most burdened child that laughter had not disappeared entirely. That somewhere inside their aching arms or calloused hands, they were still allowed to be a child, if only for a few breaths. Seasons shaped childhood more than years did. Winter meant huddling close, conserving warmth, learning patience as the world outside slept under frost. Spring brought mud, lambs, and aching backs from planting. Summer was dust and sweat and long hours beneath a punishing sun. Autumn meant gathering, storing, preparing. Each season taught different things: endurance, wonder, loss. And the child absorbed them all, without calendars, without clocks, only their senses as guides. There were no photographs to record these early years. No journals, no saved drawings on fridges. A medieval child's history lived in the memory of others, if they survived. And if they did not, they became a quiet absence, remembered perhaps for a season, or a few prayers, and then folded into the collective forgetting of the village. That was the most sobering truth: a child's life, in many places, was not guaranteed. And so each step, each breath, each lesson absorbed beside the fire or beneath the sky, carried with it the weight of both possibility and fragility. The church offered structure but little comfort. Baptism might save a soul, but it did not save a body. Catechism drilled obedience, not joy. Children were expected to sit still, recite, memorize, fear. Their role in the spiritual economy was small, but heavy. They were to be molded like wax, impressionable, easily ruined, and wholly dependent on their parents' piety to find salvation. Those with noble blood faced different pressures. Their childhoods were not freer, just differently confined. Taught to speak Latin, to hold posture, to marry well. Their toys were fancier, their meals richer, but their choices just as narrow. Daughters were bartered before they bled. Sons were trained to die or govern, whether they wanted to or not. Behind the tapestries and candlelight, they too sat with trembling hearts, wondering whether their value would ever be more than what others demanded from them. Illness reminded everyone of their place. Rich or poor, child or adult, the body could betray you. Rashes, fevers, swelling limbs. Sometimes a healer would be called. Sometimes a charm would be tied to the bedpost. Sometimes nothing could be done. And the child, watching their own hands blister or their siblings' eyes grow dull, learned quickly that suffering was not always explained, nor always escaped. Yet even so, children endured. They became apprentices, midwives, scribes. They carried pails, learned to pray, fell in love, built families of their own. The memories of those hard years stayed with them, not as sharp pain, but as grain in the wood. A pattern that shaped how they spoke, how they feared, how they hoped. Those who survived did not forget. They simply grew around the remembering. Some children, despite the odds, developed imaginations that refused to be buried. A boy staring at clouds while turning the soil. A girl humming while combing her sister's hair. They were not dreamers as we understand them, but holders of secret thoughts, small hopes that lived even in silence. Their minds wandered, if only briefly, into worlds with fewer burdens. Into stories whispered by grandmothers, into saints' legends, into tales that made them feel less alone. The home may have been cramped, but for many, it was the center of identity. Every crack in the wall, every smoke-stained beam had a story. The child came to know the rhythm of creaking wood, the placement of each pot, the scent of each season as it entered the doorway. Home was not comfort, but it was familiar. And in a world so unstable, that was something. Evenings were when reflection crept in. After labor, after meals, after prayers. As the fire dimmed, stories might be told, not fairy tales, but remembered events. The harsh winter of the last decade, the wolf that came too close, the neighbor who never returned. These were the bedtime stories. They did not lull one to sleep. They taught one to survive. And so, in that dim one-room home, with a fire that never quite warmed the corners, a medieval child lived not just as a small person among adults, but as a witness. To toil. To tenderness. To to time passing slowly and sometimes suddenly. And in their silent watching, they became the carriers of everything the world refused to write down. The sun, though pale and reluctant in the morning sky, was a silent herald of obligation. For medieval children, the first light did not signal play or leisure, it signaled labor. Before words like apprentice or servant were ever spoken, most children were already folded into the daily work of survival. There were no soft transitions into adulthood, no long pauses to discover oneself. Instead, growing up meant being useful, and usefulness often began before one could even properly spell their own name. The expectations were shaped early. In most households, if a child could stand, they could carry. If they could walk, they could fetch. If they could mimic, they could serve. Young hands stirred porridge, twisted fibers, rubbed ashes into wood to smooth it. Girls especially, though boys too in smaller homes, became second mothers before their own childhoods had ripened. They soothed infants, folded linens, cleaned wounds, learned to silence their own hunger when others were to be fed first. There was no training beyond repetition. A child observed once and was expected to remember. No second chances. No explanations. Mistakes were met with frowns or, worse, with silence. In wealthier homes, training might be more formal. A tutor with a switch in hand, a stern nursemaid correcting posture or pronunciation. But even then, affection was rare. Nurture was not a concept, only necessity. It was assumed that discipline and duty were forms of care. By the age of 7 or 8, many children were apprenticed or sent away. Boys to blacksmiths, weavers, monks. Girls to midwives, laundresses, brewers. This wasn't cruelty, it was survival. Households needed fewer mouths and more income. An extra child could strain already thin resources. So, families made choices not with sentiment but with pragmatism. A daughter sent to a manor might be safer. A son learning carpentry might eat more regularly. These were not betrayals, they were negotiations with fate. The apprenticeships were not what romantic stories later claimed. They were not cozy arrangements with kind masters and steady meals. They could be grueling. Some masters beat the children in their charge. Others overworked them. A boy might rise before dawn, stoke fires, sweep floors, and then stand for hours watching a blade be sharpened or a shoe hammered into shape. A girl might spend her entire day hunched over a washtub, her fingers cracked and red with lye. Still, not all was bleak. In a few households, kindness nestled in the corners. An old cook might sneak a child an extra crust of bread. A tired seamstress might hum while she worked and let the girl beside her join in. These small acts mattered more than they seemed. They were the difference between despair and endurance. Between a child growing bitter or growing quietly strong. Religious life offered another path, though not always by choice. Families too poor to feed their daughters might offer them to the church. Monasteries and nunneries became sanctuaries, but also cages. A child might spend the rest of their life behind cloistered walls. They would read and copy scripture, learn to chant, to scrub, to pray. Silence was both punishment and protection. Faith was required, but not always present. And many children, once placed within these holy walls, never saw their families again. Even in secular homes, religion shaped the workday. Prayers marked the hours. Saints' days interrupted the calendar with special rituals, or extra chores. Children learned to fear sin as much as hunger. They absorbed the lesson that laziness was ungodly, that every idle moment invited temptation. And so they stayed busy, not only because they had to, but because they were told their souls depended on it. In the fields, older children labored like adults. Girls bent over root vegetables, scouring for food with cracked nails and torn skirts. Boys pushed plows, herded geese, harvested grain. Muscles hardened early. Spines curved from repetition. Joints ached before adolescence. These bodies were not seen as in progress. They were expected to function, to produce, to endure. When harvest failed, children felt it first. Their portion shrank. Their shoes wore through. Their tasks grew heavier as the desperation of the adults around them increased. In lean seasons, even the small ones might be sent to gather nettles, mushrooms, or firewood from dangerous woods. The line between safety and survival blurred. Risk became routine. Still, there was pride in work. A boy who could sharpen a blade well was noticed. A girl who could spin fine thread was praised. Skill became identity. And identity, no matter how narrow, offered purpose. Children clung to that purpose, even when exhausted. Even when unseen. Some children resisted. They snuck away from chores. They stole bits of honey or rested longer than permitted in haylofts. And when they were caught, they paid. But even these tiny rebellions were evidence of life. They showed that beneath the duty and dust, childhood had not vanished entirely. As dusk fell, the work did not always end. In candlelight or by the hearth's dim glow, children mended, prepped for the next day, or listened to adults murmur plans, gossip, or prayers. Their eyelids drooped, but still they waited, for dismissal, for warmth, for a final word of reassurance that they had done enough. And when sleep finally came, it came without luxury. Pallets on the ground. Shared blankets. Soreness in limbs not yet finished growing. But it came, and with it, perhaps a dream. Not of play, but of being useful again tomorrow, and being safe while doing it. Because in the medieval world, childhood was not measured in years, but in toil. And a child was not truly seen, except in the work they did, the burdens they bore, and the silence they kept. The day a child left home to become an apprentice was not marked by celebration, but by the steady quiet of inevitability. There were no packed bags as we know them, no good luck banners, no promises of visits on holidays. Only a bundle of clothes wrapped in rough cloth, a half loaf of bread, and whatever lessons the child had managed to overhear between chores. The home they left was often no more than a single smoky room, but to a child it was the entire known world. And stepping beyond it, even to serve a blacksmith or help a weaver, felt like vanishing into another life entirely. Parents did not always cry. Some stared at the road until the child vanished from view. Some simply returned to their labor, not because they were heartless, but because survival allowed few indulgences. And the child, whose hands had barely stopped trembling since sunrise, would walk on, not knowing what was ahead, only that they could not go back. Apprenticeship was a necessity, not a choice. It was how children became workers, how households shed one more mouth to feed, how skills were passed on like inheritance. The master to whom a child was apprenticed might be kind. Or not. There were no guarantees. Some offered shelter, meals, a place near the fire. Others gave only commands and cuffs behind the ear. The child learned quickly to read moods, to anticipate orders, to work past pain. They swept floors, fetched tools, stirred vats of dye or water or wort. They memorized the sounds of craft, the hiss of iron, the creak of leather, the snap of thread. There was little praise. Only the absence of correction. Homesickness was not a thing one admitted aloud. But it lived in the bones. In the aching arms after a long day. In the silence between one task and the next. In the moment before sleep when the world went dark and the child remembered a sibling's laugh, a mother's lullaby, the shape of smoke curling from their own hearth. They held those images like coals in winter, painful, glowing, necessary. Some apprentices endured 7, even 10 years in this role. They entered as children and emerged as young adults. Bent-backed, scarred-handed, hardened in both body and spirit. Their innocence was not so much taken as it was worn away, like cloth rubbed thin over time. They learned how to listen without reacting, how to obey without thinking, how to ask for nothing but rest. But within that silence, some children carved out tiny spaces of identity. A boy who found joy in the curl of iron beneath his hammer. A girl who secretly traced patterns in leftover thread. A child who sang softly to themselves when alone, the same songs their mother once hummed while kneading bread. These quiet rebellions, these traces of spirit, were rarely punished, so long as they did not interfere with labor. And in them, something survived. There were rituals to apprenticeship, though they varied from town to town. Some involved a ceremonial coin exchange between father and master. Others required an oath before a guild. But most began and ended in dust and sweat, with little more than nods and muttered instructions. Children were not asked how they felt. They were told what they were. And slowly, over time, they became that thing. Not all apprenticeships ended in mastery. Some children were dismissed early, too weak or clumsy or sick to keep up. Others ran away, vanishing into woods or cities or silence. Those who succeeded often did so without acknowledgement. One day, they were simply trusted with more. A tool handed over without comment. A task assigned without supervision. And that, more than any title or ceremony, marked the shift from childhood to craft. The work itself became a kind of language. Hammer strokes, needle pulls, die baths, wheel turns, each with its own rhythm. A child who learned to speak that language could survive. Could one day earn coin. Could feed a family of their own. But that dream, if it existed, remained distant. In the moment, there was only the next task. The next command. The next winter to endure. Guilds offered protection, but not affection. They regulated work, ensured standards, limited competition. But they did not soothe. They did not ask whether the child missed home or whether the blisters hurt. A guild might advocate for a mistreated apprentice, but only if it disrupted trade. Emotion had no weight on the scales of commerce. Some masters grew fond of their apprentices, saw in them echoes of their own youth, gave them extra scraps at dinner, taught them tricks of the trade, defended them from others. These bonds, rare and quietly powerful, became lifelines. A child might not have family nearby, but a mentor's nod could feel like sunrise. Others were not so lucky. Beatings, hunger, humiliation, these too were part of the record. Some apprentices bore them silently, others broke under their weight. The records do not speak often of these children, but they existed. In every guild town, behind every shop door, there was a child learning that survival sometimes meant enduring the unendurable. And yet the system persisted. Because it worked. Because it fed hands into trades, kept skills alive, kept cities functioning. The child's experience, their pain, their growth, their transformation, was not the focus. Only the outcome. The most haunting part of apprenticeship was how it reshaped memory. A child who once laughed in meadows now counted days by buckets emptied and tools sharpened. Their sense of self dissolved into utility. Their name, once called in love, became shorthand for labor. And when they finally returned home, if they did, they carried with them a silence thicker than the one they left behind. Evenings were the hardest. When work slowed and voices quieted, and the child sat alone beside cooling embers, thinking of nothing, or everything, wondering whether their families still thought of them, whether the corner of the hearth still bore their shadow, whether anyone noticed they were gone. But the human spirit, even when bent, rarely breaks entirely. And so some children grew strong. Not just in muscle, but in character. They became patient, precise, proud of their craft. They learned to see beauty in form, in function, in the quiet competence that came with years of repetition. These were the survivors. The ones who could one day look at their calloused hands and say, This is what I built. And in that whispered pride, even if no one heard it but them, a small piece of their childhood, reshaped, refined, redeemed, lived on. If childhood in a medieval village was a slow erosion of softness, then adolescence was a crucible. It was not a moment of rebellion or discovery, but a narrowing. A drawing in of the self toward duty, fear, and expectation. For most, there was no age of freedom between dependence and responsibility. You simply moved from one form of service to another, from the hearth to the field, from the apron to the altar, from the whispered games of childhood to the whispered expectations of adulthood. Girls were expected to learn silence. Boys were expected to learn command. But both were expected to endure. By the time a girl bled, she was already considered a woman in many homes. There was no ceremonial celebration of her transformation. No gentle talk of selfhood or choice. There were only new rules, new dangers, and new silences. Her movements were watched more closely. Her body was spoken of as if it now belonged to others, to her father, to her suitor, to the abstract weight of family honor. If she laughed too loud, if she walked alone, if she returned late, whispers followed. Her virtue became a kind of fragile currency, more valuable than her thoughts, her dreams, or her voice. For boys, the shift was more public. Apprenticeships became real labor. Mistakes were less forgivable. Tears less excusable. A boy might be whipped for faltering with a plow, or shamed for failing to carry a full bucket. Strength was expected before the body was ready to give it. And so many boys learned to hide the ache, in their shoulders, in their bellies, in their hearts. They learned that to be trusted was to be useful, and to be useful meant to be quiet about one's pain. Adolescents bore the burdens of adults without the language to name them. Anxiety came not from questions of identity, but from the relentless presence of duty. A girl might spend her days helping a midwife deliver children she would never call her own. A boy might walk miles with a cart of goods for a master who would never remember his name. Their hands ached. Their backs bent. And still, they were told they were lucky to be learning. To be needed. There were moments, though, rare and flickering, when something softer appeared. A glance across a church aisle. A secret pass during a market trip. A few minutes of song while stirring the pot. These were the sparks of self that remained, hidden between the lines of labor and expectation. Not loud enough to rewrite their fate, but bright enough to remind them they were still human. The threat of punishment never drifted far. A girl who resisted marriage could be beaten. A boy who failed his apprenticeship could be turned out, disgraced. The law did not care about adolescence. It did not recognize it as a separate season. It only recognized obedience or failure, virtue or shame. And so, even as the body grew, the spirit remained tethered, pulled between who they had been and who the world demanded they become. For some, religion offered a mirror. Not a refuge, but a frame. Adolescents confessed sins they barely understood. They memorized psalms without believing them. They feared hell without quite grasping why. Faith was not a comfort but a code, one that measured purity, not peace. One that marked them not by what they felt, but by how well they concealed it. But the seasons still changed. The bodies still stretched. And in stolen glances or brief laughter, some teenagers carved out a sliver of selfhood. A girl who walked slowly past the river, daring to let her mind drift. A boy who lingered too long in the bakery, not for bread, but for the smile of the miller's daughter. These were not rebellions. They were survivals. Small, invisible acts of preservation. There were others, too, who bore more than just silence. Abuse, assault, abandonment. And for them, adolescence was not a narrowing but a collapse. A quiet folding inward, where hope was a dangerous indulgence. These young ones grew old too soon. Their eyes lost the softness that childhood had barely begun to shape. And still, the world moved on around them, asking them to serve, to work, to wed. Marriage loomed. Especially for girls. Some were promised before they turned 12. Others were sold quietly, through agreements of land or livestock. Their bodies not yet done growing, but already destined to carry children. Consent was not a word they were taught. Neither was choice. Only duty. Some adolescents ran, disappeared, joined bandits or cloisters, lived as ghosts along the roads, begging or stealing or pretending to be older than they were. The records remember them only when they were caught, as thieves, as vagrants, as sinners. But before that, they were just children trying to breathe. In noble households, the pressure was cleaner but no less cruel. A son might be sent to page for a lord, his every move scrutinized. A daughter might be married to a man 3 times her age, her letters filled with obedience, but her eyes aching with silence. Luxury softened nothing. It only disguised the cage. And still, amid all this, the rules, the fear, the long hours, there was endurance. A girl holding her sister's hand in the cold. A boy carving initials into wood behind the stable. A moment of song during Lent. These were the truths not written in ledgers, but they mattered. Because they reminded the world, and the child within, that life was more than obedience. That somewhere beneath the mud and linen and law, something still lived. And so, adolescence in the medieval world was not a becoming. It was an enduring. A long stretch of silence between the laughter of childhood and the labor of adulthood. And for those who survived it, the memory remained, not as a story told aloud, but as a weight carried quietly, for the rest of their days. By the time a child reached adolescence in the medieval world, there was very little left that resembled what we now call childhood. The softness of play had faded. The wonder of learning had been replaced with repetition. The body had begun to ache like an adult's, even if the spirit still felt unfinished. This was a time when names began to carry weight. No longer just the baker's boy or the shepherd's daughter, a youth might now be known by their trade, their family standing, or the mistakes they had already made. Reputation hardened quickly, and redemption came slowly, if at all. Many children had already been sent away by this age, to apprenticeships, to convents, to farms or manors where they were needed more than they were loved. In some cases, this meant opportunity. A good master might feed them, teach them, shelter them. But even kindness had conditions. The apprentice was not a son. The servant was not a daughter. And the child who failed to obey, or who faltered in their work, could be punished or cast out with little warning. This was not cruelty in the eyes of the time. It was economy. It was survival. Girls, especially, began to feel the world narrowing around them. By 12 or 13, their futures were already being spoken aloud, as if they were not part of the room. A good match. A modest dowry. A cousin in need of a wife. Their bodies changed and were suddenly subject to scrutiny, regulation, fear. Modesty became a burden they carried like wool cloaks in summer, always present, always heavy, rarely comforting. The church warned of temptation. Neighbors whispered about purity. And even mothers, who once bathed their daughters and brushed their hair, now spoke with quiet urgency about what must not be done, and with whom, and when. Boys, too, were pushed into roles. Expectations settled on their shoulders like bricks. Be strong. Be capable. Be useful. There was little room for hesitation. Emotion, if it came, was bitten back or buried beneath effort. Some found pride in their new duties, helping in the forge, tending the fields, carrying messages across town. But many carried shame instead, fearing they would fail to measure up, that their hands were not skilled enough, their backs not strong enough. And failure was not just personal. It reflected on the household, the lineage, the name. There were moments, though, when the child resurfaced, brief glimmers beneath the adult mask. A stolen hour at dusk to run beside the stream. A shared joke with a sibling over burned bread. A quiet glance toward a traveling musician, imagining life on the road. These moments rarely lasted, but they reminded the youth that something softer still lived within them. That the world was not only duty and hunger and cold floors. Friendship became more complex at this age. Bonds forged in mud and mischief began to fray under the pressures of labor and expectation. Some grew jealous. Some grew apart. Some were separated by trades or marriages or distance. And yet, the memory of shared childhood lingered, as a warmth, or a sting, depending on how the years had treated them. For those who remained close, these friendships became lifelines. A whispered confession during chores. A glance across the church aisle. A loaf of bread shared in secret. These were acts of survival as much as affection. The transition into adulthood was not marked by ceremony for most. No graduation, no certificate, no celebration. It came quietly. One day, you were asked to stay out later to watch the sheep. Another day, you were handed the key to the grain shed. Soon, someone called you man or woman in passing, and no one corrected them. The shift was not in your body, but in how others looked at you. And once the shift occurred, it rarely reversed. Illness could still change everything. A cough that lingered too long. A wound that festered. A strange ache in the joints. Adolescents, like children and adults alike, were never far from the edge of frailty. Healing was uncertain. Remedies were inconsistent. And prayers, though constant, were not always answered. The young who suffered sometimes returned to the hearth, wrapped in blankets, eyes too tired for their years. And those who recovered carried scars, visible or not, into every step of their remaining lives. Love, in the modern sense, was rare. Marriages were arranged. Futures negotiated by parents, by property lines, by inheritance. But affection still bloomed in the cracks. A shared smile at the well. A blush when passing in the market. A bundle of herbs left on a windowsill. These gestures, though small, were monumental in a life where choice was limited. And sometimes, just sometimes, they grew into something larger. Secret meetings. Promises. Risk. The church continued to press its expectations. Confession. Chastity. Obedience. Adolescents were reminded of the devil's watchful eye, of the sins of the flesh, of the fragility of the soul. Sermons became more pointed. The warnings more dire. And some youths responded with fervent faith, becoming novices, embracing discipline, clinging to certainty. Others rebelled in small, secret ways, skipping confession, daydreaming during Mass, whispering forbidden songs. Home became a place both familiar and distant. For those who remained, they began to see it differently. The cracks in the walls. The weariness in their parents' eyes. The patterns of argument and silence. They understood more, but this understanding did not always bring comfort. It brought clarity. And clarity, in a world of hardship, could be its own burden. Still, many clung to hope. Not in the way of grand dreams or ambitions, but in the hope that tomorrow might be gentler than today. That the bread would rise. That the cows would not sicken. That the neighbor would forgive. These hopes, small as they were, gave shape to the days. And in a world of labor and loss, shape was everything. By the end of adolescence, a medieval youth had endured more than many modern adults. They had known hunger, illness, grief, duty. They had watched death and learned to keep walking. They had seen kindness and cruelty in equal measure. And they carried all of it, not with pride, but with quietness. A silent strength born not of conquest, but of enduring. And so, as they stepped fully into adulthood, whether as a wife, a smith, a shepherd, a monk, they did so not with fanfare, but with familiarity. The world had already trained them, hardened them, readied them. And though they might still feel the tremble of youth in their chests, they walked forward anyway. Because in the medieval world, you did not wait to become. You simply became, piece by piece, breath by breath, under the weight of sky and time. There comes a point in a medieval child's life when the village no longer sees them as a child. There is no announcement, no celebration. One day, they simply rise at dawn and no longer wait for someone to dress them. They are expected to know how to knead the bread, how to sweep the hearth, how to keep the baby quiet while their mother gathers kindling. It happens quietly, this shift, but it is absolute. The same eyes that once overlooked their clumsiness now see every mistake as failure. The grace once given to youth dissolves, and in its place stands expectation. For many, this shift came before their 12th birthday. Puberty arrived early under malnourishment and toil, and with it came the demands of adulthood, particularly for girls. A girl's value tilted swiftly from what she could learn to what she could offer. Her body, her modesty, her silence, her hands. She would be watched more closely now, not in play, but in judgment. Was she chaste? Was she obedient? Could she sew straight seams and keep quiet when the men spoke? Her childhood was not just ending, it was being pruned. Boys, too, found their freedom narrowing. As limbs lengthened and voices deepened, so did the tasks they were trusted with, and the punishments that awaited failure. A dropped scythe, a forgotten prayer, a moment of disrespect, all carried sharper consequences. Apprenticeship might now become servitude. Work shifted from mimicry to mastery. A mistake was no longer just a child's misstep, it was a mark against the man he was expected to become. And so, they hardened. Not in spirit, necessarily, but in practice. Smiles became rarer. Curiosity dulled. The thrill of a butterfly chase gave way to the burden of hay carts, the blistering of unshod feet on frozen ground. Many bore it without resistance. Others, quietly, carved spaces within themselves to hold what joy they could. A favorite song hummed under breath, a pattern traced in the grain of wood, the secret softness in a sibling's embrace. Love, in its earliest and quietest forms, sometimes appeared here. Not romance as we define it, but the early flickers of attachment, the longing for a glance, the comfort of standing near, the ache of a name not spoken. For children whose world was work and routine, these small stirrings were monumental. A borrowed ribbon, a shared plum, a hand brushed during chores, these could mean everything. And in the memory of the grown child, they often did. The village noticed these things too. Whispers might follow two children walking too closely. A girl might be chided for vanity if her braid was admired. A boy might be beaten for lingering by the baker's daughter too long. In this world, innocence was expected to vanish quickly, but not too visibly. It was a tightrope of contradiction: grow up fast, but stay unspoiled. Work like an adult, but act as if desire didn't exist. And in this impossibility, many children simply learned to pretend. Religion now took on a sharper tone. Where once it was a ritual recited by rote, it now came laced with guilt and urgency. Confession became mandatory. Sin was no longer something adults whispered about. It was a threat that hovered over adolescence like smoke. Girls were warned of Eve's shame. Boys were lectured on temptation. Church became a place of watching, measuring, and sometimes trembling. Sundays were no longer restful. They were filled with lessons, chores, and the quiet performance of piety. For some, faith provided structure, a guide to make sense of fear and suffering. For others, it was another form of weight, a tally of their inadequacies, a reminder that even their thoughts could be sinful. Meanwhile, the body changed. Quietly, confusingly, and without permission. Girls bled. Boys ached. No one explained these things in detail. What was known was passed between older siblings or overheard in fragments. Shame filled the gaps where knowledge should have been. And through it all, the world around them carried on, expecting the same labor, the same obedience, the same silence. Some children became caretakers for younger ones. A girl of 12 might be the main comfort for an infant sibling. A boy might take over his father's duties after an injury. These responsibilities hardened their posture, slowed their laughter. But they also created something else, a quiet nobility, a knowledge that they could be depended on, even when they were barely more than children themselves. Still, the weight was immense. There were tears swallowed so no one would see. There were whispered prayers, not always for salvation but simply for rest. There were long nights staring into the hearth's last glow, wondering if life would always be this way, small, silent, and spent in service to others. But every so often, something pierced through the heaviness. A festival. A traveling juggler. A story told beneath the stars. These rare joys arrived without warning and left just as fast, but they reminded children that the world held color beyond brown and gray. That joy did not vanish, it simply waited in hidden corners. And so, the child stood at the edge of adulthood, not with a celebration, but with a slow awakening. They had survived early sickness, endured loss, learned silence, and shouldered work meant for older backs. And now, they stood not taller, but more inward, carrying within them the soft, flickering light of a youth that had not been stolen, only buried, waiting, perhaps, to surface again in another time, another place, another life. There was no age at which one suddenly became an adult in the medieval world. There was no single ceremony, no universal moment of arrival. Instead, adulthood drifted in slowly, like a change in the weather, felt before it was recognized. One day a child rose early to tend the goats, and the next day, he did the same. But somewhere between those mornings, he no longer saw himself as a child. Perhaps it was the first time he was left in charge. Perhaps it was the moment he stopped being scolded and started being expected. Or maybe it was simply that his back began to ache the way his father's once did. Girls especially crossed that invisible threshold early. When her body shifted, when her blood began its silent rhythm, a girl became someone different in the eyes of her family, her neighbors, and herself. She might still play in the yard, still carry baskets or sing to herself, But now every glance she received carried weight. She was watched, for purity, for promise, for marriage. And with that watching came a burden that grew heavier by the day. In some homes, a girl was betrothed before her 12th birthday. The decision was not hers. It was not romantic. It was practical. Her family needed alliance, security, or the promise of land. And so the girl, who still dreamed of stories and whispered secrets with her sisters, became a pawn in a larger game. Her silence was assumed. Her obedience expected. Even if she trembled, even if she cried, the wheel of arrangement did not stop. Boys, too, were shaped by expectation. If not apprenticed, they were assigned to labor, plowing, smithing, tending sheep, or hauling goods. Their strength was tested, praised, and sometimes pushed beyond reason. A boy might lift more than his body could bear, might bleed without complaint, might sleep in his boots because the work never paused. Pride was often the only reward. And survival, the only proof that he had done enough. Friendships changed in this phase of life. The easy laughter of younger years faded. A boy and a girl who once played in the fields might now avoid each other, wary of rumors or punishment. Bonds became more secret. Affection was buried beneath duty. A stolen glance, a brush of hands while passing tools, these were now dangerous, thrilling things. And yet love still bloomed. Quietly. Desperately. In the creases of daily routine. But love, in most cases, did not shape destiny. Marriage was a transaction, not a choice. Even among the peasantry, a union was discussed by elders, approved by fathers, and sometimes sealed with a coin or a keg of ale. The couple might not speak more than a few words before the vows. And when the marriage began, so did a new cycle of labor, one built not around learning, but around giving. A married woman was expected to bear children quickly. A married man was expected to provide, protect, and obey his lord. There was little space for intimacy. The home, now theirs, was often shared with in-laws or younger siblings. Privacy was a luxury, not a right. And in this crowded world, even love had to whisper. Some couples grew close in time. Familiarity bred tenderness. A wife who rubbed her husband's hands after work. A husband who saved the choicest bit of stew. These moments, though small, became the foundation of companionship. Others, however, never found that warmth. They lived beside each other, shared tasks and burdens, but never touched hearts. And in such marriages, silence became the loudest sound. Children came, often quickly. And with them came fear. Each pregnancy carried risk. Each birth was a gamble. A young mother might cry quietly after the midwife left, holding a still child in her arms. Or she might press her lips to her baby's head, knowing that neither of them was guaranteed to see another season. And yet they tried. They hoped. Because what else could they do? Faith played a role in this period of life as well. Adults were expected to model piety, to confess, to fast, to give alms. But many did so more out of rhythm than belief. The routines of prayer became muscle memory. The rituals of church, part of the social glue. And in those long Latin masses, a man or woman might not understand the words, but they understood the silence that followed them home. Hardship was no longer a surprise by this age. Illness, injury, death, these were familiar now. A man might bury a friend and return to work that afternoon. A woman might lose a child and still rise to bake bread the next morning. Grief, like everything else, had to fit between duties. But even in this heaviness, there were flickers of light. A village fair. A feast day. A traveling bard who sang beneath the moon. These were not just entertainments. They were reminders that life was more than toil. That beneath the layers of responsibility and fatigue, joy still stirred. And so, adulthood in the medieval world was not a crown placed on the head, but a cloak that grew heavier with time. It was woven from duty, sacrifice, routine, and occasionally, love. It did not announce itself. It simply arrived. And those who bore it did not always feel proud, but they felt real, as though in carrying their burden, they had finally been seen. There are moments in every childhood when the world tips slightly. not in sudden catastrophe, but in the quieter shifting of what one believes to be true. For the medieval child, this often came with the realization that their life was not wholly theirs. That what they loved, a sibling, a pet, a song hummed beneath breath, could be taken away without warning, and without explanation. These realizations didn't come in grand pronouncements. They came in glances, in absence, in the stillness after someone left and didn't come back. By the time a child reached their 12th or 13th year, they were no longer called a child at all. Legally and spiritually, they were something else. Girls were viewed as marriageable. Boys were expected to work like men. Play became foolish. Imagination became frivolous. Every movement, every thought, was slowly reshaped into what others expected from them. What they wanted no longer mattered, only what they could endure. In wealthier households, this shift was signaled with ceremony. There were tutors, feast days, formal instructions in posture, prayer, and Latin. But in humbler cottages, it arrived like weather, quietly, without permission. A girl was told she would marry soon. A boy was warned that his hands must not tremble when he held a scythe. And whatever wonder had once flickered in their eyes dimmed a little more with each passing season. The changes of the body, bleeding, deepening voices, aching joints from sudden growth, were met not with sympathy, but with command. Stand straighter. Keep your skirts clean. Don't look her in the eye. There was no space for awkwardness. No understanding of privacy or personal comfort. What happened inside a young person's body belonged to the world around them, their future spouse, their parents, the church. And the church had much to say. Priests reminded girls of Eve. They were to be modest, soft-spoken, ever vigilant against temptation. Boys were taught to be stewards, of women, of the land, of their future households. Sins were no longer small. Confessions grew heavier. Guilt took root, even before true understanding. Some children carried that guilt for the rest of their lives. Friendships, once innocent and wild, became strained. A girl and a boy who once gathered rushes together might now be kept apart. Whispers replaced laughter. Affection became suspicion. Parents looked twice at every glance, every smile. The world had rules now, unspoken but unbreakable, and a young heart was expected to bend. But even in this tightening grip of adulthood, there were rebellions. Quiet ones. A girl might sneak a ribbon from market and tie it in her hair beneath her veil. A boy might carve his name into a stable beam, a secret proof that he existed as more than labor. A kiss behind the church. A story told in the dark. These were not sins to them, they were survival. They were reminders that the self, however small, still flickered beneath obedience. The seasons brought no relief. Each one carried new burdens. Winter demanded endurance. Spring, obedience. Summer, labor. Autumn, loss. Each one chipped away at the softness that had once marked a child. Their hands calloused. Their voices grew cautious. Even their dreams, if they dared to speak them, shrank to fit the frame of expectation. Many were sent away. Apprenticeship. Service. A new household. A new set of rules. A girl who had just learned to braid her sister's hair might now be washing a stranger's linens. A boy who once chased pigs in the yard might now be hauling grain beneath a master's eye. And yet, despite the strangeness, they endured. Because there was no choice. Some found kindness. A mistress who slipped an extra heel of bread into the pocket. A master who taught a skill with patience rather than scorn. These moments, rare as they were, became lifelines. They reminded the growing child that not all power was cruelty. That sometimes, guidance could coexist with gentleness. Love, if it came, arrived awkwardly. Promises were whispered under cloaks. Hands brushed at the well. There were no novels, no poems, no courtly rituals for the peasant heart. But there was longing. There was hope. There was the ache of seeing someone across the market square and wondering if the future could be chosen, rather than assigned. Sickness still stalked the young. An aching tooth, ignored, could turn to fever. A chill could become pneumonia. There were no doctors, only remedies passed down in whispers, herbs tied in cloth, prayers muttered at dusk. And when a child died, or a youth newly grown, the loss felt no smaller just because it was common. For those who survived, the journey into adulthood was not marked by birthdays or parties, but by silence. The first time they were not asked what they wanted. The first time they gave in, quietly. That silence, thick and familiar, marked their passage. They were no longer children. They were part of the weight now. Carriers of burden. Makers of silence. Yet within them, somewhere, the child still lived. Not always in memory, for memory fades, but in reaction. In how they flinched when scolded. In how they stared too long at a window. In how they tightened their grip on kindness when it came. Because in a world that expected so much from the young, what survived was not innocence, but endurance. There is a quiet weight that settles on a person when they cross into adulthood without ever having been a child in the way we understand it now. In medieval times, that weight pressed in early. For most, there was no rite of passage to mark the transition. No sweet 16, no celebration of independence. One simply woke up one day and understood that the world expected more from them, without announcement, without mercy. The hands that had once fumbled with wooden toys now gripped tools, held grain sacks, or reached into the dirt for roots that might stave off hunger. There was no time to wonder how they got there. Only time to survive. By the age of 14 or 15, many young people were fully folded into the adult world. Some had been married off. Others had buried siblings or parents. Still others found themselves responsible for their younger kin, navigating a world of debts, rents, and shifting seasons without the buffer of guidance. If a father had died early, to war, plague, or exhaustion, it might fall on a boy barely grown to manage the land, or on a girl to care for a home of 7. Their bodies changed, but without comfort. There were no physicians to explain menstruation, no counselors to talk about urges or fear. A young girl might be wed before she even understood her body. A boy might be sent off to war or labor before his voice had settled. There were few questions and fewer answers. Silence was safer. Silence, in many homes, was survival. Love, if it appeared, did so in glimpses. A shared glance at the well. A loaf of bread passed without a word. Touch was rare. Permission even rarer. Courting among peasants was not done with flowers and poems but with negotiated intentions, watched by neighbors, shaped by land, dowries, and survival. Among the noble class, affection mattered even less. A union was a strategy, a family alliance, a transaction masked in ceremony. And still, they hoped. Not loudly. Not recklessly. But in the small, stolen moments. A girl sewing by a window, glancing out when she heard footsteps. A boy pausing in his labor to sketch a name in the dirt. Most of these hopes withered. But some survived, tucked into marriages that somehow grew tender. Others faded into memory, folded into work and age. For many, this was also the age of first grief they could not escape. Not the passing of an elder they barely knew, but the loss of someone they loved, a sister lost in childbirth, a friend taken by fever. And with that loss came a new silence. A new layer of weariness. They stopped asking why. They learned to carry grief like a hidden bruise, pressing into them with every bend of the back, every lift of the arm, every step down the same muddy path they had walked since childhood. The church demanded more of them now. Confession. Conformity. Marriage within bounds. They were judged not as children making mistakes, but as souls accountable. The sins of youth were now real sins, and they weighed heavily. A missed mass. A stolen egg. A kiss exchanged in the wrong season. Every act tallied in the mind, or whispered to a priest who offered absolution with one hand and warning with the other. This age also brought the bitter sting of comparison. That boy plowed straighter fields. That girl bore healthier children. That couple had 3 goats. This one had none. Status was a current, and though many swore they cared little for it, they felt it all the same. In a world where survival left little room for ambition, even the smallest advantage felt vast. Young people learned quickly how to swallow envy. How to smile at a wedding they secretly mourned. How to carry praise like a shield, and silence like armor. They aged not in years, but in habits, in the way their shoulders hunched sooner, their laughter faded quicker, their eyes followed the ground more than the sky. Yet there were still small joys. A good harvest. A kind midwife. A feast day with dancing. These joys were not erased by hardship, only shortened. They flared and vanished like fireflies in summer, reminders that life, though often cruel, could still offer beauty in stolen moments. Friendships changed too. The playmates of childhood might now be spouses, rivals, or gone altogether. New bonds were formed in work, 2 women hauling water together, 2 men patching a thatched roof, exchanging news and laughter between hammer blows. These were the moments when humanity slipped through, brief but potent. Their inner world deepened. Without books, many turned to memory. Songs passed down became prayer and comfort. Riddles, sayings, and the rhythm of shared labor became their intellectual inheritance. And through this, even the poorest carried a kind of literacy, not of letters, but of life. Seasons no longer marked excitement but demand. Spring meant lambing and planting. Summer was sweat and storms. Autumn was storage, preserving, bracing. Winter, the test of everything. Each year that passed layered a new coat of understanding. And each year they endured. Among the noble, this time was no gentler. A young lord might be sent to war, a lady to court. Expectations pressed in from every side. Chastity, obedience, glory, diplomacy, all watched, measured, recorded. One misstep could mean disgrace. One success, a lifetime of being beholden. Some rebelled. Quietly. A late return from vespers. A secret meeting in the orchard. A refusal to marry the chosen man. Others bent without breaking. They learned to wear duty like a cloak, beautiful on the outside, threadbare beneath. They did not call it adolescence. They did not mark it with ceremonies or speeches. But it was real all the same, this long, aching threshold between childhood and full adulthood. It was a time of becoming, of loss, of hope barely whispered. A time when the world asked more of them than it ever had, and offered little in return. And yet they stood. Weary, wiser, still soft in places the world had not yet hardened. And from that silent standing, a new kind of strength began to grow. Not the strength of warriors, nor saints, but the quiet, invisible strength of those who bear the weight of centuries without ever leaving a mark upon them. Adulthood did not arrive in a single moment. It crept in slowly, disguised as small expectations. A girl might be told to cover her hair, to hold her tongue, to rise earlier than before. A boy might be sent alone to the fields, trusted with a heavier load, or asked to speak to a stranger as a man would. There was no celebration, no rite of passage marked by drums or ceremony. Just an increasing quietness, a sobering of the eyes, a new ache in the joints that hadn't been there the winter before. In the medieval village, adulthood was not a prize. It was a shadow that lengthened until you simply found yourself standing in it. Many of those who crossed that invisible threshold did so in silence. Their dreams, if they had dared to speak them, were either reshaped or discarded. Some learned to hide their thoughts in the creases of their clothing, in the pause before answering a question, in the way they held a tool or folded their hands during prayer. This was not lying. This was survival. Because honesty, real honesty, about fear, or shame, or longing, was often too heavy for the world around them to carry. Love, when it came, did not look like the songs promised. It looked like a shared chore done without complaint. A slice of bread given before one's own. A hand resting on a shoulder without words. These were the intimacies that survived in a place where affection was often practical rather than poetic. Marriages were arranged for land, for cattle, for alliances. But sometimes, something softer grew in the spaces between expectations. Not always. Not predictably. But sometimes. And yet many also married without love. Without choice. Without even much conversation. A girl could be spoken for before she bled. A boy might find himself betrothed to a name he'd never heard until the day of his wedding. The church blessed it. The village watched it. And the couple endured it, some finding companionship, others finding only resignation. Resignation took many forms. For some, it meant waking each day to a life they had not chosen. For others, it meant watching their own children repeat the cycle. A daughter taught to serve before she could read. A son taught to dominate before he could understand the meaning of fairness. And beneath it all, the slow erosion of wonder. Not by force, but by routine, by repetition, by necessity. Still, not all wonder disappeared. Sometimes, a moment pierced through. A night sky too beautiful to ignore. A song hummed while turning the soil. A child's laugh that reminded you of your own. These flashes did not save anyone. But they stayed, tucked away like coins under a floorboard. Proof that something softer still existed, even if it was rarely spoken of. Some turned inward, seeking refuge in prayer or poetry. In symbols scratched into the corners of bread loaves. In patterns sewn into the hems of garments. These quiet rebellions were not political. They were personal. A way of marking one's own presence in a world that rarely asked your opinion. A way of whispering, "I was here. I felt this." Others found small power in knowledge. The ability to read a psalm. To measure cloth. To treat a wound with herbs. These skills, however humble, offered a sense of identity. They carved a shape into the blur of daily life. A shape that could be handed down, remembered, even cherished. Illness came and went like wine through the thatch. There were days when a cough deepened and never left. When a rash became a wound. When a fever burned so hot that the body trembled into silence. And through it all, adults, still so young by modern reckoning, cared for others as best they could, knowing that their own end might be only a season away. But even in that fragility, strength grew. The kind of strength that does not boast. That does not lift weights or wield swords, but instead endures. That rises again, and again, and again, not because it wants to, but because no other choice is available. That is the strength that shaped medieval adulthood. The marketplace became a mirror of adult life. No longer a place of wonder, it became a site of calculation. What could be traded? What could be spared? Who might be watching? Every transaction carried the weight of reputation, obligation, survival. It was not about gain, but about not losing more. The church remained a steady presence, but its messages changed. No longer did it speak only of heaven and forgiveness. It now echoed with duty, penance, hierarchy. Adults were not asked to believe, they were commanded to conform. And many did, not from faith alone, but from fear. Of damnation. Of community judgment. Of stepping outside the invisible lines. Time moved differently now. Days bled into one another. Years passed without notice. A harvest remembered only for its failure. A winter remembered for its cruelty. Joy came in fragments. A healthy birth. A good yield. A kind word from someone who rarely offered them. These were the milestones now, not birthdays, not anniversaries, but survivals. And amid all this, the person who had once been a child still lingered. Inside the adult frame. Inside the habits and hesitations. That child was not dead, but hidden. Watching. Occasionally rising to the surface in a moment of laughter, or awe, or sudden sorrow. Reminding the adult that something was once tender here. That something still could be. Some tried to teach their own children differently. To soften what had been hard. To explain what had been enforced. But the world did not always allow for such kindness. The fields demanded labor. The neighbors demanded conformity. The church demanded repentance. And so many parents found themselves saying the same words they had once hated to hear. But there was resistance. Always resistance. Even if only in thought. A woman who took longer at the well, just to breathe. A man who listened when his child cried, instead of shouting. A gesture, a choice, a refusal. Small, maybe. Invisible to others. But powerful in its defiance. And in these quiet moments, between dusk and chores, between birth and burial, adulthood revealed itself not just as burden, but as witness. To what had come before. To what might come next. To the fragile, sacred act of continuing. There comes a moment in every life when the shape of childhood no longer fits, yet the world does not offer a new form to grow into. This was especially true for those born into the rough timbers and cold hearths of the medieval world. By the time a child reached what we would now call adulthood, 16, 17, 18, they had already lived a life measured not in grades or milestones, but in seasons survived, crops harvested, siblings buried, and duties fulfilled in silence. There was no ceremony to mark the end of youth. No pause to reflect, no celebration of transformation. One day, you simply stopped being a child. And no one mentioned it again. The final chapter of growing up was not marked by freedom, but by acceptance. Not celebration, but repetition. A daughter might now be married, her own womb now the site of the same fears her mother once carried. A son might now bear tools heavier than his spine could manage, stepping into a father's role not because he chose it, but because there was no one else. The faces of adulthood were familiar, even if their weight was new. Tiredness behind the eyes, the tightening of one's voice, the absence of dreams that once fluttered at the edges of thought. What was passed on was not wealth, or wisdom, but rhythm. The rhythm of the day, of the seasons, of duties that asked nothing but endurance. The same paths walked barefoot since childhood became the routes to market, to chapel, to the fields that now expected yield. A daughter taught her child the same lullabies she once heard from a mother now hunched and gray. A son dug the same furrows as the father who taught him, now buried without a marker under the trees near the edge of the land. Love did not vanish, but it changed shape. The soft affections of childhood, hand-holding, whispers, songs, became gestures of survival. A shared crust of bread. A cloak offered in rain. A silent glance across a dinner table, tired but knowing. It was love not as expression, but as continuation. To care for someone was to keep going, to fetch water, to carry weight, to not give up. And so the young adult of the medieval world did not declare love. They became it. Memory, too, took on a quieter tone. Those who had survived the illnesses, the winters, the griefs, they did not speak often of their childhoods. But they carried them. In the stiffness of their backs. In the way their hands lingered on the heads of children they tucked in at night. In the way they walked fields or sat through sermons. Childhood became a private ache, folded away and carried like a keepsake. A shape held close, even as the body grew beyond it. There were moments, though brief, flickering, when the child returned. The scent of fresh bread. The sound of a stream gurgling over stones. A song heard through a tavern door. And for a heartbeat, the burden lifted. The years dissolved. And the adult, stooped and bound by duty, remembered a younger self who once believed the world was wider than the village, that life might one day feel light. Those moments didn't last. But they mattered. Because they reminded them that something soft had once lived inside their ribs, and maybe still did. The world did not thank these children turned adults. It did not write their names, or carve their faces in stone. They left behind few records. Their handwriting was shaky, if it existed at all. Their stories remained in the corners of parish books, in the margins of legal scrolls, or not at all. But they were the ones who kept the world turning. Who fed the soil, bore the children, carried the traditions, kept the fires burning even when the wood was damp. And as age came, slower for some, brutally fast for others, it did not offer rest so much as a different kind of rhythm. Knees that ached with cold. Eyes that dimmed in candlelight. The blessing of being needed less, and the ache of being noticed less, too. Some found peace in this. Others found only loneliness. But they all remembered. And in their memories, the full shape of their life unfolded, hard, yes, but full. The last transformation was not loud. There were no grand goodbyes. The village did not stop. The chores did not pause. But one day, a child who had grown into an adult became an ancestor. And the fire they once tended now warmed the feet of someone new. And that, perhaps, was the quiet legacy of every medieval childhood, not a name carved in stone, but warmth passed on, breath by breath, into a world that kept going. So when we imagine those lives, not as numbers in history books, But as full, breathing stories, we must do so gently. Because in each of them was a silent triumph. Not of conquest, or glory, but of endurance. Of finding ways to keep living, keep loving, even when the world offered nothing easy. And in that softness, in that strength, we find not just the truth of the past, but something we still need today. And so, the day ends, not with triumph, not with rest, but with the aching silence of survival. UV made it through the kind of day most would never imagine, and few could endure. But for millions who lived in those forgotten centuries, this wasn't a challenge. It was simply life. The cold. The hunger. The rules. The waiting. It's easy to romanticize the past. Harder to remember what it actually felt like to live inside it. Thank you for spending this quiet time here tonight. If these gentle histories speak to you, you're always welcome to subscribe. Now, no need to get up. The fire is still crackling. Let it keep you company, while the rest of the world sleeps.